Most non-trivial mobile applications require that you make some network requests. This video shows you how to do that, and it pays particular attention to how to do that on iOS devices, which can be kind of tricky because of something called app transport security. This video is brought to you by Code Cookbook, your source for great recipes for building great React Native applications. Let's go ahead and get started. So you can see here we have an iOS app, and if we scroll down to the JSX that's rendering this view, we see that we have a touchable highlight, and what we want to do is make it so that when we click this touchable highlight here, we're going to make a network request. So let's go ahead and start doing that now. And we're going to actually get our data from the Hacker News API. So the method that's going to be invoked here when we want to make our network request is going to be called fetchStory. So let's go ahead and bind that method in the constructor of this component. Now, React Native has this kind of global fetch function that we can use to fetch data from that network. So that's what we're going to use here. And here's our URL for the React Native or the Hacker News API call that we want to make. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. And you can see down here that there's actually an error that occurred when we tried to make our network request. And the reason this happened is because of something called App Transport Security. It's a new requirement in iOS 9 that requires all apps by default to use HTTPS for their network requests. And this can be problematic if we're using an API that we don't actually have control over, whether that API is serving content via HTTPS and the particular certificate that's being used and all of that. And so what I want to show you is how you can actually tweak the app transport security settings so that you can make network requests and kind of keep developing your application. So let's go ahead and do that now. And actually, before I do that, I want to show you something called the Network Inspector. So I just pressed Command D on my keyboard here, and this opened up the menu, and then I can show Inspector, and there's a Network tab. This was actually just introduced in version 0.33, and then when I click this button, I can see detailed information on the particular network request that I tried to make. And you can see actually that the status and the timeout and the response URL, all of this is undefined. And this is actually good evidence that your network request is failing because of ATS. So let's go ahead and fix this now. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up the Xcode project for our app, and when we do that, this opened up to the info.p list, and that's where you want to be. And there's this key here called App Transport Security Settings, and then there's an exception domains dictionary, and we want to add a dictionary for the Hacker News API so that we can kind of tweak ATS's settings for specifically the Hacker News URL or domain. So let's go ahead and do that. So the name of the dictionary will actually be the domain name, and we'll make this a dictionary. And then we're going to add, now you'll notice here that there's this localhost exception here, and this is required because of the way that React Native actually communicates with the iOS device. This is kind of how they do hot reloading. So there's this key here where they kind of tweak ATS's settings, and I'm not going to get into the details here, but I'm just going to copy that key so that it's underneath this dictionary that I just created here. And then I'm also, in this particular case, I actually need to add another key to tweak ATS. and this key has to do with forward secrecy, and I don't want that to be required in order for my network request to be successful, so I'm going to go ahead and set no as the value there. So with these two things in place, I should be able to make a network request. Now, because I've actually made this change in Xcode, or in other words, I've made the change outside of JavaScript, I'm actually going to need to recompile the application to make sure that these changes take effect. So let's do that now. Let's actually close Xcode, and then I'm just going to run iOS from the React Native command line. Okay, and it looks like that's done. So now I'm going to reopen this network application, and you can see that the inspector is still open, so that's handy. So let's go ahead and click, and now we see that the network request has actually gone through. But actually here you can see that there's a 404, there's an error here. And the reason this actually happened is because we actually have a typo here. We're missing an N in the URL. And so once I add that there and refresh and tap this button and then look at things in the inspector, I can see that the status code is actually 200, and I can actually see the payload that I'm getting as a result of making the network request. So the network inspector is actually really handy for kind of debugging, what goes wrong with your network requests, and I definitely recommend it over logging or even putting in different maybe JSX like text elements to kind of see what you're getting back from the network. Well, that's it. That's how to make a basic network request in React Native. And again, this video is brought to you by Code Cookbook. Be sure to check it back soon to see new recipes for building great React Native applications.